22. Sunlight filtering through the trees woke Zoticus, who had to admit he'd slept quite well. So had Lady Sarah, it seemed, who had fallen asleep to the sound of his fake snoring. She was fortunate that he had magical means of keeping watch, that didn't rely on her ability to stay awake. Not that he'd expected to be attacked, there were too few people left alive to do so, after the plague had passed through. And he'd hear an angry mob from Miroton a mile away, more than enough time to awaken and hide. He broke his bread in half and used his knife to spread the remaining cheese across both pieces. "Would you like to break your fast, Lady Sarah?" Her eyes flew open and for a moment they stared at him in shock. Then she recovered, sat up and said, "Yes, thank you, Master Zoticus." She accepted the offered bread and cheese. Even brave Melisande had suspected poison the first time he'd handed her food. Yet Lady Sarah bit into her breakfast without hesitation. "Aren't you worried I'll poison you?" he asked. She shrugged. "If you poison me, you won't be paid. You may speak of honor, but a man who kills for a living expects to be paid. An assassin with your reputation would not have lived this long if he were a fool, and nothing I have seen so far has made me think otherwise, even if you do own a motley cloak." He felt his cheeks redden. It was a gift from a friend. She rose, dusted off the cloak she'd slept in, and held it out to him. "Then I should return it. My thanks for loaning me such a precious gift." He wasn't sure if she was simply being courteous, or trying to taunt him. "If ever you have need of my cloak again, you have only to ask, my lady." Her fiery eyes said hell would freeze over before she'd ask any such thing. But she finished her breakfast, then washed her hands daintily with a flask of water. "I'm ready to leave as soon as you are," she said. It wasn't long before they were headed back along the road, to Miroton. Somehow he'd ended up carrying his things and her lantern, so she had both hands free to pick berries from the bushes beside the road as they walked. The first person who spotted them was a girl with flower-dusted skirts. Zoticus glanced at Sarah, wondering if she'd want him to hide so that she might pretend that she hadn't seen him, but she was too busy greeting the girl. "Mistress Sarah, you must do something. Ahab has everyone locked in the church, and he won't let Father Fazio release them until they agree to go on a crusade." "Ahab has the whole town locked in the church?" Zoticus swore. If even one of them was afflicted with the plague, they might pass the pestilence on to everyone. Better to burn the church down than release them, if they were all going to die anyway. Not to mention suffocating from smoke inhalation was a far more merciful way to die than succumbing to the plague. The girl shook her head. "No, not the whole town. Just the children and anyone who isn't married yet." "Tobias?" Sarah asked. "Yes, him too." For a moment Sarah looked stricken. But only for a moment. Her hand landed on his arm. "Master Zoticus, you will free the children from the church. Take them to the traveling camp, where I will meet you with supplies for the journey." What? What had he missed that suddenly he had to steal an entire town's children? They weren't rats, responding to a magic whistle. And there was absolutely no way he was taking children on a crusade. He wouldn't have even taken Melisande if he hadn't seen that vision where she helped him get justice from those damned knights. "I'm not taking kids on a crusade," he burst out. Her hand on his arm squeezed gently. "Bring them to the traveling camp, and I will explain everything," Sarah said. Then she grew thoughtful. "Goats. We'll need to bring the goats." She hurried off, beckoning for the miller girl to follow her. Too late, Zoticus realized he'd somehow gone from saving one boy to kidnapping half the town. If it had been anyone else asking, he would have chased after them to argue, but instinct told him he'd be wasting his time today. Lady Sarah was certainly a force to be reckoned with. He wagered she'd be wondrous in bed. A pity his vision had cut short last night's kiss, or he might already know. At least if they were to journey together, they might have another chance. Then again, maybe not with 100 children coming along. He sighed. He'd find a way. Eventually. Or she would. 23. The people of Miroton liked putting bloody big bars across their doors, Zoticus decided, struggling to unbar the church door. He'd pull out his magic key to do the job if he had to, but he shouldn't have to. It was simply a matter of the right leverage, and, finally, he leaned the bar against the wall and threw open the church doors. The town's children, huddled at the other end of the church before the altar, squinted in the sunlight streaming into the windowless building. Two of the bigger boys, old enough to consider young men, stood before the group, ready to defend them. Zoticus had to admire their courage. The smaller of the two stepped forward. "You may tell Elder Ahab that our vigil has not changed our resolve. We will not go with you on a crusade to the Holy Land." Zoticus did not remember madness being one of the early symptoms of plague, but it did seem like absurd ideas were spreading faster than usual through the town. "Good," Zoticus replied. "Because one crusade is more than enough for any man. I'll not be going on another. Anyone with any sense will not be heading for the Holy Land, but in the opposite direction. Up into the mountains maybe until the plague has passed." The boy frowned. "You mean on a pilgrimage to see some holy relics?" "Yes. Some remote place with holy relics, high in the mountains. Somewhere so hard to get to, the plague had not reached it yet." "You mean like the cloister of the Holy Innocents? To see the jewel-encrusted skeletons?" the bigger boy blurted out. The smaller boy turned to him. "You've been there?" He shrugged. "Master Goiko journeys there once a year to trade herbs. They have some rather unusual ones that only grow high in the mountains, and because the Rialto traders can't go any further up the river, he buys extra to take to the cloister. I used to go with him when I was younger, but now he leaves me to tend the shop while he's gone." The apothecary's apprentice, Zoticus presumed. "Could you take us there?" Zoticus asked. The boy shrugged. "Maybe. Once you're on the right road, it's hard to get lost." "Why?" "Who's going to the monastery? It'll be autumn soon, and the high passes won't be open much longer. One decent snowfall and you're stuck there until spring." That sounded perfect. "We all are, if we want to survive this plague." The smaller boy was not as trusting as the apothecary's apprentice. "Why should we go anywhere with you? This is our town. We're not rats to be driven out and drowned." Zoticus winced. He hadn't expected this to go well, but this was worse than he'd expected. "Because Lady Sarah told me to take you." The two boys exchanged glances. The bigger one shook his head. "You take it up with her. I wouldn't dare argue with Mistress Sarah." The smaller one nodded. "I'd better get the goats. I'll never hear the end of it if I leave them behind." Before Zoticus could stop him, the boy darted out of the church, toward the town green. Zoticus stared after him. Should he go after him, or just save the rest of the children? Lady Sarah had said to save all of them, but perhaps she hadn't considered him coming up against the obstinate goat boy. "Do you think he'll come back?" Zoticus asked the apothecary's apprentice. "Of course. Tobias said he was going to get the goats. It might take a while to get them all moving, but even he knows better than to cross his mum." Zoticus's heart sank. Of course the boy was Sarah's son. "Take everyone here down the road to the first travelers' camp, to wait for me. We'll meet you there with or without the goats," Zoticus said. Without, if he had his way. Animals would only slow their progress up the mountain. The boy nodded and started issuing orders to the rest of the children. Zoticus headed for the town green. Saving Sarah's son was proving harder than he'd thought. 24. I haven't even managed to get the cart unloaded, Sarah admitted as she opened the barn. Probably a good thing, as now we have less to load. Wherever we'll go, we'll need supplies. It could be months before it's safe to come back. Where will we go? Sylvana asked. Sarah sank onto a bench, burying her head in her hands. I don't know. When she'd asked Zoticus to save Tobias, she'd meant for the two of them to travel someplace far away, where they'd be safe from the plague. Two people could easily disappear, with enough coin to pay for whatever they needed along the way. But half the town. Even Sarah did not have enough coin to pay to feed and house so many. They'd have to rely on the charity of strangers, a chancy thing in good times, but if the plague had truly wiped out the other towns along the river, who was left that they could turn to? If Mercurio had not gone far, perhaps he could be persuaded to take everyone aboard his ship. If they were to travel aboard a ship though, they'd need to take all their provisions with them. She'd need everything on the cart, and most of the contents of her cellar too. Not to mention another cart, or creatures who could carry things. Miroton did not have anywhere near enough ponies to take a tenth of what she had stored in the cellar. I'll get the goats, she said. No need, my lady. You have only to wish, and it shall appear. Master Zoticus? Even Sarah had to stare as the man appeared in the middle of a flock of what looked like the whole town's goats. She shook her head. Goats were difficult to handle at the best of times, or so Tobias and her husband had told her. How an assassin could get them to behave so well, it would take some powerful magic. Mother. Tobias appeared, and the riddle was solved. Master Zoticus here said we were to meet you at one of the traveling camps along the road before heading up the mountain, but Raphael told me it takes some time to get there, and they are not accustomed to hosting guests. We do well to bring our own supplies. Now the goats have only carried sacks of hay down from the high pasture in the past, but if we could keep their loads light, we might be able to take some of the sacks of chestnut flour. Between the four of them, they managed to load most of the cart's contents onto the goats, and fill the cart with casks from the cellar. Sylvana brought a second cart, which was soon full too. Sarah set the pigs loose in the chestnut orchard, hoping she'd be able to return before they ate next year's harvest. Surely she wouldn't be gone that long. Did you see Mercurio's ship on your way to Miroton, Master Zoticus? He could not have gone far. Perhaps if I rode ahead, I could catch him and ask him to return for the rest of us. With his new ship, he can surely take us anywhere we want. Far from the reach of this plague. He stared at her for a moment, then muttered an oath. Mercurio the river trader made it to your town? No wonder the plague came here too, he was carrying it aboard his ship. Yes, I found the trader's ship, but his corpse was already cold. The plague took him too. The ship was tainted, so I burned it. Her heart sank. Then where will we go? Tobias made an impatient sound. Have you forgotten, Mother? Master Zoticus is taking us up to the monastery in the mountains. She blinked. It made sense now that she thought about it. What better place than a church dedicated to the Holy Innocents to shelter her town's children from this scourge? Of course, she said. Let me get a few things from the house, and we shall go. By the time she returned with a sack of clothes for herself and Tobias, she found only Zoticus waiting for her. Where is my son? She asked. He jerked his head toward the road. He and the miller's girl went on ahead with the goats and one of the carts, leaving the other one for you. I said I'd wait for you. For a moment, her heart softened toward him. It was a sweet gesture, waiting to make sure she wasn't left behind. Like something a friend would do. But Zoticus was not her friend. So much for protecting my son. What if something happens to him while you were waiting for me? Sarah snapped. Zoticus merely shrugged, as if her anger meant nothing to him. He's got 100 goats and the miller's girl, armed with a stout cudgel. If anyone had wanted to stop us from leaving, they've had ample chance, yet I've seen no one. The last time I saw a town this quiet, it was Altino, and it was because everyone was dead. I didn't want to say it in front of the children, who all seemed to be in good health, but everyone who wasn't locked in that church might be infected, or already dead. Sarah sighed heavily. Yes, I haven't seen anyone about either. Can this plague really strike people down so quickly? One day they seem in perfect health and the next day they are dead? Once the infection takes hold, death comes quickly. Usually a few days, but sometimes less. It can hide in the body, not coming out to kill right away, waiting several days or even a week. It can spread through rats, fleas, and sometimes between one person and another, through the very air we breathe. Creeping in the dark, where we cannot see, only to strike us down without warning, this disease sounds much like an assassin, she said. Zoticus frowned. There you are wrong, Lady Sarah. An assassin only kills where there is profit to be made from the death. This plague kills without a care for fortune or honor or virtue. It cannot be stopped. Whereas an assassin is mortal, we sicken and die like anyone else. As will you, if you change your mind and stay here instead of coming with us to this monastery. For a moment, she longed to stay. This was home, and perhaps she could help those who were sick. The plague couldn't kill everyone. Don't even think about it, Lady Sarah. I'll throw you over my shoulder and carry you all the way up the mountain myself. Before she could stop it, a giggle escaped from her lips. She'd heard tales of barbarians in far-off lands who carried women away like that, but she found it hard to believe that this assassin, whose courtly bow was a thing of beauty, could be anything like those savages. She regained her composure, hoping he hadn't heard her silly giggle. If you plan to carry me, how will you protect my son? Really, Master Zoticus, you are the strangest assassin I've ever met. She swept past him to take the pony's bridle, urging the creature to start pulling the cart toward the road. She thought he heard him mutter something half under his breath, but she couldn't make it out, so she dismissed it as not important. Not when they had a camp to reach before nightfall and a long journey ahead of them. 25. Stubborn woman, Zoticus muttered under his breath as Sarah set off with the cart. He said it again when he saw her making the rounds of all the children, speaking to every single one, before she allowed herself to rest for the night, though he could see how exhausted she was. She'd given her cloak to a child who had none, refusing to let the child return it. She was the last to eat every night, though she was the one preparing the meals. And more than once, he'd caught her milking the goats in the morning, to make sure everyone had some milk with breakfast before they started traveling for the day. The journey was tortuously slow. They barely covered a third of the distance Zoticus alone would have done in a day, and sometimes even less than that. Between the smaller children and the goats, it would likely be well into autumn when they arrived at the monastery, but Sarah would not countenance the suggestion that any of them be left behind. She was the sort of lady any barony would beg for. Without servants or a husband, she saw to the needs of everyone in her care. Yet to everyone except her son, she was Mistress Sarah, without her proper title, because they saw her as one of their own. When she was so much more. They'd been traveling a week when the road grew steeper, headed into the mountains proper, and it took all his concentration to keep the pony headed up the road instead of stopping or turning around and heading home, which is what the silly creature wanted. This was why Zoticus didn't own a horse. Not because he couldn't afford one, but because relying on a creature with a mind and will of its own was a recipe for disaster. That, and once he'd ridden Godfrey's divine mare Pegasus, every other horse seemed as slow as this grumpy pony. The next day the road grew steeper still, and the miller's girl almost tripped over her own feet as she ran to him. Master Zoticus, it's Mistress Sarah. She's fallen behind, the girl gasped out. You take the cart. I'll see to Lady Sarah, he said, heading off. He found her at the very back of their procession, leaning heavily on a goat that did not appreciate being anyone's crutch. "Lady Sarah, are you all right?" he asked carefully. "I'm fine. Didn't sleep well last night is all. I think there was a particularly sharp stone under my back that I couldn't seem to dislodge. I'm fine." The goat took advantage of her distraction to bolt toward its fellows higher up the hill, heedless of Lady Sarah, who would have landed in the dust if not for Zoticus, who swooped in to catch her. Then she began to cough. "Lady Sarah," he began, not sure how to say what he dreaded. "I'm fine. I just breathed in some of the dust that stupid beast kicked up when it ran away is all. I'll just take a drink and be fine." He handed her his flask. While she drank, he palmed his healing amulet. He'd surreptitiously used it to scan each of the children in turn, relieved when their blood had shown no signs of the plague, but somehow he'd never checked Lady Sarah. Now it might be too late. He pressed his thumb to one of the sharp claws holding the green stone in place, hissing as he felt it break the skin. A drop of blood was the price of certainty, and with Lady Sarah, he needed to be certain. She had to reach the monastery on the mountain to realize his vision. She couldn't possibly have the plague. She couldn't. He touched the amulet to her side. To heal her, it was best to have skin contact, but to simply see what ailed her, her dress would not impede his diagnosis. "Please don't let it be the plague," he prayed silently as he searched her blood for signs of the dreaded pestilence. No and no and no, it wasn't there. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. As always, Lady Sarah was right. She was fine. But just to make sure. He lifted her off her feet and carried her to the nearest cart. "You shall ride up here for the rest of the day." "I can walk just fine," she protested. "That may be, but you didn't see that goat's expression. I'm sure he's not far away, plotting vengeance with all the other goats. You'll be safe from him and his friends up here where he can't reach you," Zoticus said. "I'm not afraid of my own goats." "Stubborn woman," he muttered. Thankfully, she didn't hear him that time either. 26. Zoticus didn't need to say it, but she knew he suspected it, as surely as she did. Once she'd started coughing, it was only a matter of time before she died of the plague. She kept herself apart from the others, mindful that the disease could be spread from one person to another, and she did not want any of their deaths on her conscience. Not when she would likely die soon herself. She rode in a cart now instead of walking alongside it. No one said a word, but she could feel Zoticus watching her. Waiting for her to die? She wished she had let him seduce her that first night in camp. One last memory to take with her into whatever came next. Instead, she'd die wondering whether Tola was right, or whether he'd prove to be a good lover after all. Lady Sarah. She almost thought she could feel his arms around her, laying her down, loosening the lacing on her gown, preparing to make love to her. If this was to be her last thought on this earth, then at least it was a most wondrous dream. 27. They rounded a bend and Zoticus took his eyes off Sarah for a moment to take in the sight of the mountain monastery, the castle from his vision. It soared above them, clinging to the cliffside like some sort of magical creation, ruling over the world. Thank heaven the gates were open, because the place would be nigh impregnable if they were shut. A slight cough drew his eyes back to Sarah. She toppled sideways in her seat, ending up slumped against a barrel that was all that kept her from tumbling out of the cart altogether. Zoticus called for a halt. He lifted her out of the cart, not caring about anything but her right now. The kids, goat and human alike, parted to let him through. He marched into the castle bailey, shouting for a healer. But no one came. He shouldered his way through the doors to the great hall, still shouting for help, but there was not even a fire lit there, though someone had laid one in readiness. He tugged off his cloak and spread it out on the flagstone floor before laying Sarah gently on the fur. He lit the fire, making sure it was well alight before he dared to take his eyes off it. Sarah needed warmth and healing, and he wasn't sure he was powerful enough to help her. The children had followed him inside the hall, and some approached the fire, holding their hands out to warm them. They were alive because of her. They owed her. Search the castle. See if you can find someone, anyone. Lady Sarah needs a healer, he said. Tobias, Raphael, Silvana, and many of the other older children spread out to obey his orders. The younger ones just stood around and looked lost. For the first time in he couldn't remember how long, Zoticus knew exactly what that felt like. Sarah coughed weakly, her breath rasping in her throat. He untied the lacing on her gown, hoping that would help her breathe, but still she struggled. I need a healer, he howled, hoping whoever was here in the monastery would hear him and come help. I haven't found a healer, but I have found the best bedchamber. Mistress Sarah will be more comfortable in a bed than here on the floor. Zoticus stared around, looking for the source of the voice. Silvana, the miller's girl. He'd learned her name and others on the journey, but now he could scarcely remember his own name. Is there a fire there? He demanded. I lit it myself before I came down here. The bed could probably do with an airing, but if we stoke the fire hot enough, that should at least drive away the damp air. Silvana beckoned. Bring her. Zoticus bundled Sarah up in his cloak and followed the girl. The feather bed was piled high with furs. The fire had done little more than take the chill out of the air, so he set Sarah down and proceeded to wrap her warmly. What else can I do for her? Silvana asked. Find her a healer, he said. She nodded and left. An eternity passed while Zoticus held Sarah in his arms. Her breathing was loud, but as long as she still drew breath, he could help her. He hoped. There's no one here. The whole place is empty. I've brought Raphael. Silvana shoved the boy forward. Now I'm going to see if I can get the kitchen fire started, so we can cook something hot for dinner. Raphael, the apothecary's apprentice, stood awkwardly beside the bed. I found the still room. There are many herbs hung up there, most of which I recognize, and shelves full of jars that could contain anything. It will take some time, but within a few days, I should be able to make something to help Mistress Sarah. What would be best for her cough is oil of rue, but that will take weeks. Oil of rue. Hadn't the witch's girl sold him some? Zoticus reached into his pouch, and the vial materialized in his hand. Only a few drops, he muttered to himself, holding the vial over her lips. Carefully, he counted out 3 drops before corking the vial again. The boy was still there. Do what you can, Zoticus said. I have enough oil of rue to do for some days yet. Raphael left. Zoticus pulled his healing amulet from beneath his tunic. He sliced his thumb open again, smearing blood across the stone before touching the amulet to Sarah's throat. This time, he wasn't looking for plague. He wanted to know what ailed her, in the faint hope that he might be able to fix it. Her throat was inflamed, but the infection went deeper, coating the passageways carrying air to her lungs. No wonder she had so much trouble breathing. If he could but lessen the inflammation. Master Zoticus, you're bleeding on my mother's gown. Zoticus palmed the amulet as he rose from the bed to face Tobias. The boy's face was pale. Is she? She lives, though she is very ill. Perhaps now we are no longer traveling, she will be able to rest and recover, Zoticus said. The boy nodded feverishly. Good. Very good. For a moment there, I thought. He shook his head. Is it the plague? No. I think she took a chill and the rigors of travel made it worse, Zoticus said. Some of the girls have found the kitchen, and they say they will prepare dinner for everyone. The younger children have found what we think is the monks' dormitory, and they are busy bringing in straw for the beds so that we might sleep there. There is a sort of village green where I have left the goats, but I will have to milk them before the sun sets. The carts. Tobias continued, but Zoticus stopped listening. He'd brought them here because he'd seen Sarah in his vision, running across the bailey, and nothing else mattered but her. She had to recover because she still had to appear in his vision. Tobias had finished talking, and he appeared to expect a response. Good, Zoticus said. See that everyone eats and gets some rest, and ask the kitchen to send up some broth for Lady Sarah. When the boy had gone, Zoticus set the healing amulet to work again. He wasn't certain, but he thought the swelling in her throat had lessened a little. Just a little more and she might find it easier to breathe. For the first time in his life, he wished his mother were here with him. With the powerful magic running through her veins, a single drop of her blood would heal Sarah in a matter of moments. But he was all Sarah had, so he'd do his best. Hoping that she'd wake up and thank him, so he could deliver that terrible line about being honored to be of service, and see desire burn in her eyes. Or maybe it was just irritation. Right now, he'd settle for seeing her eyes open. But they didn't open at all again that day, or during the night. 28. Slowly, Sarah became aware of voices. There was Tobias, Silvana and occasionally Raphael, always talking in hushed tones so that she could not always make out the words. Regret smote her. Had she passed the plague on to them too, so they were all dead? Served her right for trusting an assassin with her son's life. For the first time, she wondered if he'd receive a bonus for killing her too, or whether that was always part of his plan. Or the plan of whoever had sent him. The Bishop of Rialto most likely, who had always coveted the rich lands around the monastery. If they were all dead, then the lands would fall to him. There was someone else there too. Someone who moved silently, never said a word, and smelled strongly of rue and other medicinal herbs. One of the monks, preparing her body for burial? She wished she could have told him she'd prefer for her body to lie beside her husband's in the churchyard in Miroton, but she knew as well as anyone that the dead could not talk, let alone make their wishes known. At least the strong-smelling monk didn't leave her. It was comforting to know that she was not alone. Perhaps that was why it was customary to hold a vigil before a funeral. If the soul had not yet been taken to heaven or hell or wherever they went in between, the loneliness was enough to overwhelm them. Well, it threatened to overwhelm her. Only the scent of the monk and the gentle touch of his hands kept her from screaming out into the void she'd found herself in. No bishop should be able to steal her boy's birthright. And then one day, the voices were no longer quiet. It is unseemly that you are alone with her, when she is so vulnerable. She is a virtuous widow. Were she well, I know she would not allow you to enter her bedchamber. I have been remiss in my duties to my mother, to allow it to go on so long. But it must stop. That was Tobias, speaking with unaccustomed authority. She hoped whoever he was speaking to could not detect the nervousness in his tone. Would you rather I did not heal her? She has been very ill, nigh unto death. If I had not been here, nor would she. It took her a long moment to place the second voice, because she wasn't as familiar with it as her sons, but those smooth tones could only belong to Zoticus the assassin. I am grateful for your assistance, Master Zoticus, and will happily pay you for your healing services. That someone like you has such skills came as a pleasant surprise, but your services are not required here anymore. As you say, she is improving and will wake soon. What will it do to her if the first thing she sees when she wakes is an assassin? I will not have her frightened. You must go. Raphael can heal her now. A pause. Perhaps we should take this discussion outside her chamber. Lady Sarah needs her rest. I would not wish her to wake to heated words when she has suffered enough. Footsteps and the sound of a door closing. The scrape of a bar being laid across the door too, if she was not mistaken. Tobias was taking no chances that anyone would enter her room. The door must have been well made, for she could not hear their conversation if it continued at all, once the door was closed. Then Zoticus's words hit her. Nigh unto death. Near but not quite. She was alive. A flood of feelings overwhelmed her. Regret at not seeing her husband again soon. Joy that she might see and speak to her son again. Anticipation that she might thank Zoticus for whatever it was he had done. And uneasiness because he'd said there was no cure for the plague. So whatever he'd done for her, it would surely come at great cost. The scent of rue assailed her nostrils again. The monk was still there. He would know what Zoticus had done, surely, for the monk never left. He would have seen all. Tell me, by what miracle have I survived the plague? She asked softly. Gentle laughter was his first response. There are no miracles here. You survived because you left Miroton before you were infected, along with the young people you commanded me to save. You fell ill because you took a chill, I believe, likely the night you spent with me in the forest. Traveling took its toll and infection set in. Stubborn woman that you are, you hid your weakness well, so that the infection was far advanced by the time we arrived here at the cloister. Healing you, that took magic, I'm afraid. But I will show you if you wish. She opened her eyes. Zoticus stood before her, clasping something in his hands that she could not see. She scanned the room and was surprised to find that they were alone. Where is the monk? She asked. There are no monks. The cloister was deserted when we arrived, and none have returned from their quest for plague survivors. I last saw them in Altino, burying the dead. It is possibly none of them will return, for corpses carry the plague too. She took a moment to digest this. No monks, and Tobias had said Zoticus was her healer. She reached for his hand, which he allowed her to bring to her nose. Sarah inhaled deeply once, twice, 3 times just to make sure. You smell of rue, she said. Oil of rue helps to ease a cough like yours. It has also been known to bring on visions of the future, and I hoped. He shook his head. What did you see of my future, Master Zoticus? She asked, curious. He pulled his hand from her grasp and looked away. I saw nothing I did not already know. Evasion. Interesting. She would ask him again later. Other questions burned more brightly on her tongue. And what of my son? She'd heard his voice only a short time ago, so curiosity and not worry fueled this question too. He smiled. Your son is snoring, asleep outside your door. He is not a particularly effective guard, but he is a dutiful son. No one can unbar your door without waking him, so you may sleep soundly. Yet how are you here? He spread his hands wide. An assassin has many secrets. Surely you do not expect me to share them all? She folded her arms across her chest. Only this one. He jerked his thumb at the wall hanging behind him. There's a servant's stair behind that tapestry. It comes out near the kitchen, hidden behind another tapestry. She nodded. So if I asked you to bring me dinner, you would be faster than anyone else, who would have to convince my son to unbar the door first? He laughed. If you're hungry, that is a very good sign. I admit I am not as good a healer as I am an assassin, so to know that I have successfully healed you is most gratifying. You said you would show me how you'd healed me, she said slowly. Tola said you might have magic. Is it true? Now that is a secret I have never shared outside my family, he said. She'd known Tola long enough to hear how magical bloodlines worked. That's because they have magic too. She fixed him with her gaze. You said you would show me if I wish. Well, I do wish. His courtly bow made her smile. She'd never thought to see it again. As my lady desires. He thrust out his hand as if to seize her breast. Suddenly she became aware that she was only wearing a thin shift, and not the one she'd been wearing on the road. This one was cut so low if she leaned forward her breasts would spill out. Did you undress me? She demanded. He stepped back, dropping his hands by his sides. I did consider it, but the miller's girl, Silvana, took your clothes for laundering. When I returned, I found you wearing a fresh shift. Should you wish to change again, I'd be more than happy to assist you. I'm not unfamiliar with helping women out of their clothes. A few of those courtly bows, a smile just like the cheeky one he wore now, a handful of courtly compliments delivered in that cultured voice so deep she felt its vibration in her belly. He wouldn't have to lift a finger before women removed their clothes for him. There was a definite question in his eyes, now too. After all, she was lying in an enormous bed in nothing but a thin shift. It would only take a word for him to join her. If only her breath hadn't caught in her throat. She blinked and that look in his eyes was gone. You're still not quite well, Lady Sarah. You did say you wished to see how I heal you. She eyed his hand, once again headed for her breast. She still couldn't see what he held in it. Perhaps you should tell me first. He flipped his hand over and showed her the amulet resting on his palm. A cloudy green stone, framed in an ornate silver setting. A thick leather thong dangled from it, as though he normally wore it around his neck. This is a healing amulet, given to me many years ago by a powerful enchantress. Its healing powers are activated by my blood, and my blood alone. While I wear it on my person, it helps my body to heal faster, saving me from many a wound that might have been mortal and destroying diseases, including the plague, when they come into contact with my blood. Sarah nodded slowly. So it has a price, this healing amulet of yours. The magic in your blood. The witch who gave it to you must have been very wise. Zoticus smiled. That she is. What she did not tell me is that I might use it to heal others too, but as you have already guessed, it comes at a price. A blood price. The magic in my blood activates the amulet's healing powers, but the amulet must be close to the person I wish to heal. The magic is strongest when it rests against the skin, near the wound or sickness. So for your infection, I would place it over your heart, or at your throat. Only a fool allowed an assassin anywhere near their throat. Then again, Sarah suspected he posed even more danger to her heart. You're the healer, Master Zoticus. Where will it do the most good? 29. If he placed his hand at her throat, he knew he would cup her face and kiss her. If he put his hand on her chest though, he'd have to remain rigidly in control, concentrating only on healing her and not the deliciously soft flesh beneath his fingers. I would prefer your heart, he said without a word of a lie. But then he had to swallow manfully as she pulled the neckline of her shift down to expose half her breast. By all that was holy, he wanted. Please heal me, she whispered. Zoticus shook himself. He'd never been this distracted by a woman, not since before he became an assassin. He took a knife and sliced open his palm, then laid it atop the amulet. The stinging pain helped him concentrate on what he should be doing, and not anything else. The swelling in her throat had gone down, but the infection still lingered in her blood and in her airways. He focused on burning it out of her blood and the rest of her body, until none of it remained. There. It was done. Gasping, he pulled away from her, and the amulet tumbled to the floor. He dropped to his knees, feeling for it in the darkness, for the fire had died down to embers. He'd been healing her for a long time. Pain pierced his hand, and he drew the amulet out from under the bed. It was a thirsty thing, but worth the blood price he'd paid for healing her. He'd do it again, even if Sarah had been infected with the plague, instead of some simple infection. It's done. "You're completely healed, Lady Sarah," he said. "Your body will still be weak as you recover, but the illness is gone." He headed for the fireplace, so that he might mend her fire before he left. "How did a man like you become an assassin, Master Zoticus?" she asked. He had yet to meet another man even remotely like himself, but he did not correct her. "It was so long ago I scarcely remember," he lied. "Please try," she said. "Because you've spent years shedding blood for a living, and tonight you've shed yours to save my life. I want to understand how you can." He stayed silent for a long moment, determined to fix her fire. Far too soon it was again blazing merrily, licking at a fresh log. "I have a twin sister. Now she's a powerful enchantress in her own right, while there isn't enough magic in my blood to cast a spell without an enchanted object to focus it. So she used her elemental magic as easily as breathing, while I spent most of my time in the woods around where we lived. Our mother was the village witch, much like your friend Tola, so I would hunt and trap in the forest and bring back meat for our table. One day my sister's friend went missing. We were not much older than your son Tobias, but everyone else our age was settling down and getting married, having children. All except us and her friend Amis. Now Amis was fond of stories, and there are plenty of them, telling how some brave noble knight or lord or prince finds a girl in the woods, saves her from something fearful and makes her his wife. It was no secret that Amis dreamed of marrying a knight, at the very least. And it so happened that a party of knights came to our town, on their way to a tourney of some sort, but they intended to break the monotony of their journey with some hunting. A few days after their arrival, Amis went missing. And my sister, who could level a castle, drain a lake or stir up a storm so strong it could blow a grown man down, could not find out where the girl had gone. So she asked me to track her, and I did. It took me hours, but I tracked her to a camp where the knights had spent the night. But the camp was empty, and the only prints I found leaving the camp were all from horses' hooves. So when Amis left the camp, it had to be on horseback. "Oh, the poor girl," Sarah said. Zoticus shook his head. "Oh, she was willing enough, I wager. She wanted to marry a knight, and she'd found a whole company of them. She'd have her pick and live happily ever after, or so I thought. So I went home to tell my sister." My sister, who'd seen more of the world than me at that point, being an enchantress and all, feared even more for her friend. She knew not all knights and noblemen were honorable, and even if these ones were, she still wanted to make sure her friend was happy. So she sent me off after them. He sucked in a breath. Should he tell her or not? His instincts told him yes. That night I had my first vision, though I thought it a dream at the time. I saw Amis in the forest, lying in a pool of blood. Even thinking it was a dream, it was enough to spur me on after her. Now this was a mounted hunting party. They followed whatever prey took their fancy, which led them a merry chase. I was a boy on foot, following their tracks. But I knew they were going to a tourney, and when they got there, they would stay for some time, so I kept on following those tracks, hoping I would find them eventually. They stopped to camp and roast a deer they'd caught. When I found their camp, they could not have been gone a day. But the knights were all gone. Only Amis remained. I didn't see her at first. She was huddled in the bushes weeping, and when she saw me, she tried to hide. Of course I hadn't tracked her over so many miles to be fooled by a few leaves, so I pulled her out and begged her to tell me what was wrong. Her story started out like any of the tales she loved. The knights fought an impromptu battle for the honor of sitting beside her, and the winner, well, I don't know if it was that night or later, but he took her into his bed, telling her all manner of stories about how much he loved her and wanted her for his wife. For a few weeks she was completely under his spell, until they approached the town where the tourney was to be held, not a day's ride from where I'd found her. On the last day, after he'd satisfied his lust, her seducer told her he no longer loved her, and they all rode off, leaving her there. I was horrified by her tale, but offered to take her home. That only made her cry harder, until she produced a knife and stabbed herself in the chest. Then she tore the knife out of her breast and flung it across the clearing. By some terrible mischance, she'd pierced her heart, and there was no saving her. Within minutes, my vision lay before me, her body in a pool of blood in a forest clearing. "Did you love her terribly?" Sarah whispered. Zoticus laughed. "Amis. By all that's holy, no. She was Zoraida's best friend, and if I so much as thought about kissing her, my sister had promised she'd set fire to my bed. Oh, my life would have been so much simpler if I'd fallen in love with Amis. Then I'd never been in love in my life, and the village girls knew me as the enchantress's twin brother, son to the village witch, with no magic of my own. As far as eligible bachelors go, I think I was just above the pig boy, and that was only because I was better looking." Sarah smiled faintly. "Were you more modest then too?" "Heavens no. If anything, I thought I was invincible. Like most boys that age do. So I swore on Amis's body that I would seek vengeance for her lost honor. A boy against trained tourney knights. I was a hunter, not a fighter. I must have lost my mind. Luckily, by the time I reached the tourney grounds, I'd regained my wits, and instead of challenging them or something else equally stupid, I filled a vacancy for a stable boy at the inn where they were staying. I listened to the gossip, watched the tourneys, and soon worked out that I was no match for any of the knights. Worse, the one who'd seduced Amis had a new bedwarmer, and the girl could not have been more than 12 years old. When the tourney was over, I attached myself to Sir Seducer's party as a groom. We hadn't been riding long before I discovered that not only did the man pick up a new maiden to deflower in every town, but he had a wife at home, waiting for him. Now I'd grown up with enchantresses. I knew women ruled the world, and I thought my best chance would be to tell the knight's wife about his crimes. Until I met the girl. Zoticus took a deep breath. Lady Gemma was the most exquisite girl you'd ever seen. She looked like an angel, and she could not have been a day older than I was. Younger perhaps in years, but not when it came to the ways of the world. She had eyes as pale and hard as twin diamonds. Because unlike the peasant girls her husband had seduced, Lady Gemma's father was a knight, who'd insisted upon marriage between his daughter and his fellow knight. Whether money changed hands or they were just very drunk, I know not, but Lady Gemma only warmed her husband's bed for a few weeks, before he tired of her and returned to seducing innocents like Amis. Lady Gemma also wanted vengeance on her husband. And she began by taking her husband's newest groom into her bed. Sarah's jaw dropped. She really was the virtuous widow her son thought she was, if that shocked her. Lady Gemma, young though she was, ruled her husband's estate. He was off chasing virgins or tawnies or deer for most of the year, so she grew accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. And she was no different in the bedchamber. It turned out I was not her first lover, and she was most particular about how she wished to be made love to. At first, I thought it was a fitting fate for Sir Seducer to learn his wife had lost her heart to me, as Amis had to him. But as I became more familiar with every bit of Lady Gemma's body, I soon learned that she had no heart, and that she was inexorably winning my own. How could I not think myself in love with her? She insisted we make love multiple times a night, pleasuring her in between, and if the other grooms found me asleep in the hayloft after another strenuous night, they just muttered that I was Lady Gemma's lover and let me go back to sleep. This went on for some months, until one night Lady Gemma claimed to be ill and banished me from her bed. The next morning, a servant brought a message from her that she wished me to deliver a letter to her husband, wherever he might be, and to attend her in her chambers that night. Any hopes I'd had of sharing her bed again before I left were dashed when she greeted me with the letter I was to carry, and a whispered promise that she would consider taking me into her bed again if I were to make sure her husband never came home, so she'd be free to marry again. And like the fool I was, I believed her. When I caught up with Sir Seducer, I cannot remember his name, for all my names for him were epithets then, It was at the start of another hunting expedition. I joined the other servants and waited for my opportunity. I had never killed a man before, but I was determined to do this for Amis and Lady Gemma. Sir Seducer shot a stag, then dismounted so that he might finish it off. The other knights had started chasing another target, so he was alone. Then, the only enchanted object I owned was my flute, the same one I used to summon the rats in Miroton. That day I used it to bring a boar. The beast go-read Sir Seducer in the back, and then go-read him again as he lay writhing on the ground. His friends heard his screams and came to help, but there was nothing anyone could do. He died in agony several days later, and I was jubilant when I headed home to tell the good news to Lady Gemma. Years had passed, but he never forgot that day. He'd been such a fool. She was at dinner when I arrived, and I had to deliver my news to her in the great hall, standing below her on the dais. She ordered that the house be placed in mourning and dismissed me. That night I went to her bedchamber, just like I used to do, only to discover that it had been turned into a nursery. The bedchamber where I'd made love to Lady Gemma all those nights now belonged to twin boys, so tiny they could not have been long out of the womb. The boys' wet nurses stared at me until one of them had the presence of mind to direct me to Lady Gemma's new chamber. There I learned that the boys were now Sir Seducer's heirs, though the knight had not shared her bed in years, and she would rule in their stead until the boys came of age. All the servants, of course, would swear to the boys' legitimacy, for they were hers, heart and soul. I delighted at the thought that my sons, for who else could be their father, would have lands of their own and knightly titles. I promised her I would train them well, and spend every day teaching them to be better men than her now dead husband. And my knights would be hers, of course, as was her right. She merely laughed, tossed a pouch of coins on the floor at my feet, and said if I ever breathed a word about our arrangement or attempted to see the boys again, she would hire a real assassin to hunt me down and silence me forever. And so I went home. After a considerable amount of time begging Lady Gemma to change her mind, Zoticus thought but did not say. Lady Sarah already thought he'd been foolish. She did not need to know the entire extent of his idiocy. But her eyes were wide over the hand she'd used to cover her mouth. How old were you? When I went home, I was a few weeks shy of my 18th birthday. I spent more than a year in Lady Gemma's service. Have you seen your boys again? Zoticus grinned. Several times. They both became knights, and while they do occasionally host tourneys, now they have come into their inheritance, they are far too busy managing the vast estate Lady Gemma amassed from her 4 former husbands to waste as much time on such things as Sir Seducer. Do they know you're their father? No. Lady Gemma gave them plenty of father figures, before she chose widowhood again. She contracted some other assassin for the other husbands, as I would not take the contract. Did you regret killing the first knight? Zoticus hesitated. He suspected most people regretted their first kill, but he never did. No. He preyed upon children and felt no guilt for his actions. How many more girls like Amis and Gemma would he have harmed if I had let him live? Death was too good for him, but it was the only justice I could give them, so I did. If Lady Gemma came to me now and asked me to kill her first husband, I would still do it. Do you still love her? This time there was no hesitation. No. I don't think I ever truly did. I was in love with the idea of a woman who wanted me in her bed, every night. A boy's brain is in the head of his cock at that age, as I'm sure you know. Sarah snorted with laughter, which sent her into a coughing fit. Zoticus leaped to grab the potion that soothed her throat, which he'd been keeping warm on the hearth. He helped her sit up so that she could drink, and when she finally had the breath to speak again, she was so close. Have you ever loved a woman? Yes. And he'd give everything he owned to lie her down and make love to her right now, but her son was right. She was vulnerable after being so sick, and he had no right to take advantage of this virtuous widow. So he bade her good night, and took the servant's stairs up to the small chamber he'd claimed as his own. 30. Open the door, this is heavy. Sarah woke in daylight to shouts in the passage outside her door. Though she'd been utterly exhausted from Zoticus's healing and whatever the sickness had done to her body, she'd lain awake for far too long last night, her mind churning through all the things he'd said. He was an assassin, a rat-catcher, a hero, a healer, a flirt. He'd been 16 or 17, the same age as Tobias, when fate had turned him into, not so much an assassin as a vigilante. He'd gone after justice, killing a knight for crimes he'd committed, and only circumstances and the horrid Lady Gemma had turned him into an assassin after the fact. Such a horrible, heartbreaking story that she wanted to be fiction, but he'd told it without leaving out his own foolishness, so she knew it had to be true. He'd brought them here, to the cloister of holy innocence, and healed her with his own blood. Her thoughts darted back to that first day he'd appeared in the council hall, when he'd announced that he'd saved the town from the plague. He might not have saved everyone in town, but he'd saved enough of them. He'd said that night in the forest that he wouldn't lie to her. Had everything he said been the truth, even when she doubted him? The door to her chamber burst open, and a parade of people came in. First came Zoticus with an enormous wooden tub, like a larger version of the one they used to crush the chestnut shells. He set it down before the fire and waved the next person through. The rest were children, each carrying a bucket of water, which they sloshed into the tub. Then they headed out again. 4 buckets each, and then you may go to the kitchens to get your apple from Sal, he shouted after them. Master Zoticus, my mother is not well. You shouldn't shout like that in here, Tobias said. Zoticus bowed in her direction. My deepest apologies, Lady Sarah. Now, how would you like me to shout at the children bringing water for your bath? Poor Tobias looked lost. He'd spent all his life herding goats and learning to lead the people of Miroton, but Zoticus was outside of anything he'd ever had to deal with before. Even Sarah wasn't sure how to handle him, especially after last night. But she knew she definitely wanted to. Your cheeks look flushed, Mother. Has your fever returned? Or is it too hot in here? Should I bank the fire? Or send Raphael down to the still room for some medicine? Or are you thirsty? I can send down to the kitchen for some goat's milk. I'm fine. Truly, Tobias. Master Zoticus has taken good care of me. Who knew he had such healing skills? I am still tired today, but perhaps tomorrow I will be well enough to leave my bed. Don't worry about me. She managed a smile, hoping her cheeks had cooled. I'll ask one of the children to bring me something from the kitchen to break my fast. I'm sure you have more important things to do. He wrinkled his nose. I've been trying to teach a few of them to take care of the goats. They're slowly grasping the idea that they must watch them all the time, but teaching them to milk the goats so far has been a disaster. Was I ever so fumble-fingered? Well, you did learn young. As soon as you could walk, you wanted to help with the milking. It takes time and practice. Then again, perhaps your new goat herds simply don't have the right touch for milking. See if you can find some of the children who came from families that owned goats, and whose job it was to do the milking. Even if it's just to help teach the others, with extra skilled hands, the milking will go faster. Tobias nodded. Thank you, Mother. It's good to see you well again. I don't know how we've managed without you. Zoticus stepped forward. You'll have to manage for some time longer before Lady Sarah is truly well again. She still needs rest. Tobias opened his mouth to argue, but the bucket brigade had returned, and the noisy splashing and clattering as the children filled the bath up further prevented all conversation. When they were gone, Sarah got in first. I still am terribly tired, Tobias. All I seem to want to do is sleep. Your body needs sleep to heal. It's only natural. Once the children are done bringing up water for your bath, you should sleep again. The water can warm by the fire while you sleep, so it will be ready for you when you wake. In the meantime, I'll go down to the kitchen and fetch you some food." Zoticus bowed again, then departed. Tobias waited a moment, then dropped his voice. "Mother, are you sure we can trust him? Father Fazio said he's an assassin and he has committed so many terrible crimes. The only way he can earn forgiveness for them is to go on a holy crusade. I fear for your life, leaving you alone with him." Yet Sarah had no such qualms. "Not anymore. He has healed me of his own volition when he had plenty of opportunities to do me harm, yet he did not. He has already been on a crusade, which is more than Father Fazio has, so I'm not sure the priest is any position to judge him. If Zoticus has a heavy conscience, then that is his burden to bear. He will be judged for his sins at the end of his life, as will we all. Rumors abound about his actions in the past, but who is to say any of it is more than common gossip? What I've seen of his actions since I've met him show him to be selfless, and somewhat of a hero. He saved my life, but he also saved all of us from the plague. We all should be grateful to him, you more than anyone." "How can you be sure he didn't bring the plague to Miroton?" Tobias persisted. Sarah considered for a long moment. She couldn't truly be certain, but anyone who comes into contact with the plague falls ill. Isabel was ill before Zoticus arrived, yet Zoticus has showed no signs of illness. He survived the plague before, but he was still very ill. No, the plague arrived before he did. Before Father Fazio received word from his bishop about Altino. It must have been Mercurio. Zoticus said he'd seen Mercurio's ship on his way to Miroton, and Mercurio was already dead of the plague. The hay he brought from Altino must have been tainted. I remember Isabel and her father saying the first thing they would do with it was to restuff their mattresses. She closed her eyes. Poor Isabel. Ahab wanted you to marry her when she was old enough, you know. Tobias edged away from her, as he always did when talk turned to marriage. I have work to do, mother. But it is good to see you recovering. When he reached the door, he hurried away. When Sarah could no longer hear his footsteps, the tapestry twitched aside and Zoticus stepped into the room. You're wrong, you know. I bear part of the blame for the plague coming to your town, even if it arrived before me. When I returned from that accursed crusade, we boarded 3 ships at Bizzers that had been left behind after a battle gone wrong. The rats aboard carried the plague, and few of us survived the voyage to Rialto. I asked one of the Rialto merchants, a man I trusted, to see that the tainted ships and their cargo were burned. Perhaps he forgot, or perhaps he was too greedy to give up what he saw as his, but he did not burn those ships. And when he died, his sons inherited them. Not knowing their history, they sold the ships and the cargo to your river trader, Mercurio. So while I may not have carried the plague on my person to your town, I am not blameless in the matter. I should have burned those ships the day they arrived in Rialto. By the time I did burn them, it was too late. I should have been more outspoken at the town council meeting, and insisted we take precautions to keep the plague out of Miroton and prevent its spread. Instead, I let Ahab overrule me and allow trade to continue despite the risks. I knew the hay had come from Altino, and I could have commanded it to be burned, but it did not occur to me that it would be necessary until now. It was my duty to save Miroton, and I failed. None of us are blameless in this, except maybe the children. Children you saved. I should have saved more. So should I. But we do what we can, try the best we can, and we'll never be able to save everyone. Sarah sighed. Perhaps you should have let me die instead of healing me. So many regrets. No. Zoticus set his tray of food on the table beside her bed. The moment I arrived in Miroton, I knew I was not too late to save someone, at least. I knew you would survive the plague, but only if you left Miroton. How? He wet his lips. I saw a vision of you. Here. Well, in the bailey here, not this bedchamber. Sarah paled. You mean you saw me dead, like your friend Amis? No. I saw you alive, very much alive. You run across the bailey. That's all I see. Relief trickled into her chest, making it easier to breathe again. Then your vision won't happen today, as I feel far too weak to walk across this room, let alone run anywhere. Zoticus smiled. Ah, that I can help with. You should have some of this broth while it's still warm and then see if you can sleep again. You'll regain your strength faster while you're asleep. Will you be here when I wake? She wasn't sure why it was so important to her, but it was. Where else would I be? 31. By the time Lady Sarah woke again, her son had already barred her door for the night. If Zoticus had had any sense, he'd have stayed on the other side of that door, and let her bathe in peace. But as he evidently had no sense, he gave in to his selfish desire to watch over her while she slept. After all, he had said he'd be there when she woke, and he valued her good opinion. Perhaps more than he should. He'd set out supper for the two of them on the table, and checked a dozen times to make sure the water was warm. He'd left a pile of stones on the hearth, ready to drop into her bath to heat the water even more when she was ready. He'd even brought out his enchanted candle, which warmed a room better than any fire could. He was taking no chances that she'd catch another chill. Lady Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She took in the room with a single glance, then said, "Alone at last." There was a throaty purr to her voice, just like she'd had on the day he met her. She really was recovering. Zoticus bowed his head. I will leave you alone to bathe, if you wish it. Though he hoped she didn't. Some healer you are. What if I am too weak to walk to the bath? Please stay and stand watch while a stubborn old woman washes. He snorted. You're not old, Lady Sarah. You cannot be a day older than me. But I am stubborn. I see. Ooh, is that supper? Am I allowed to eat something before I have my bath? If your appetite has returned, it's a very good sign. Yes, if you're hungry you should eat. He eyed her for a moment. Do you feel up to sitting at the table, or would you prefer to eat in bed? I haven't spent this long in bed since I was a new bride. His mouth gaped. Had she really said that? Sarah winked. It was so much softer than rolling around in the pasture or the hayloft, and when there's no one to interrupt, you can take more time to really enjoy yourself. She glanced at the door. I take it the door's barred again? Yes. Though your son found a padlock to fasten it with today too, so he could sleep in his own bed instead of outside your chamber tonight. Was that your doing? Already she knew him too well. Perhaps. It might have just been a happy accident. He shouldn't have done it. Without the boy listening outside the door, he might do something reckless. I think we should have supper at the table, she said, thankfully interrupting his thoughts before they went too far. Yes. He carried her over to the table and for a time they ate in silence. Zoticus finished his portion before she was halfway done with hers, so he headed for the hearth to heat up her bath. He used tongs to transfer the hot stones into the water, which hissed and steamed where the stones hit the surface. After a few minutes, he tested the temperature, then took out the stones. The bath is ready when you are, he said. A rustling sound behind him made him turn. He could do nothing but stare. She'd slipped out of her shift and stood naked beside her chair. He'd never seen anything so beautiful in his life. He didn't have the words to describe her. And then he did just one soft. So soft he ached to touch her, kiss her everywhere. Which of course made him, her opposite, suddenly hard. "I'll help you," he said, rushing to her side. He lifted her up and carried her to the bath, then let her down gently into the water. He dropped to his knees beside the tub, hoping she hadn't noticed. Then his traitorous hand picked up the washcloth and he found himself asking, "What would you like me to wash first?" What happened next he could only describe as pure agony. Stroking the soap and the cloth over her skin, reminding himself every moment that he was her healer, yet aware of her every breath, each time she closed her eyes and every time she moved to grant him better access to her magnificent body. At least when he was on his knees, his tunic hid his erection. "I think I'm clean now." She sounded regretful. Now he had to help her out of the bath, dry her and get her back to bed. Without her seeing that his mind was full of very UN healer-ish thoughts. He held up the towel like a shield. "Climb out then." When she was finally back in bed, mercifully covered by the sheets, he tried to form an excuse so that he could escape before she saw. "The water's still warm. You should have a bath too," she said. "Yes." His tongue had turned traitor too. Now he had no choice but to turn his back and take his clothes off. 32. Sarah knew she was wicked to watch Zoticus undress and climb into the bath, particularly when her body was most definitely showing her age and held no attraction for him, but she wasn't getting any younger, and this might be her last chance to see a good-looking man naked. The muscles that had only been hinted at when hidden by his tunic were all on display now. She could see how he'd lifted her so easily. Yet he'd been so gentle when he handled her in the bath. If he'd shown the slightest spark of interest, she'd happily invite him to share her bed. Actually, she wasn't above begging. She hadn't ached this badly for a man since she could not remember. "I can feel your eyes on me." "What are you thinking?" he asked. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to laugh or cry. "I was wishing I was a young maiden again, pretty and comely still, so that I might tempt you to come to my bed." There. Let him think what he liked of her. His shoulders hunched, then he turned to face her. "Lady Sarah, I cannot believe that you have ever been more beautiful or irresistible than you are now." He slowly rose and the water cascaded off him. She couldn't stop staring. "That looks painful," she managed to say. "I've been thus afflicted since you first took off your shift. I've never been so powerless to control myself since I was a boy." Just the sight of him jutting out so pointedly made her braver. "Come to bed." He began to dry himself. "I want to do that more than anything, but I keep reminding myself how deathly ill you have been, that you are still weak, that I should not take advantage of you while you are so vulnerable. I'm first and foremost your healer and you should be resting." Sarah smiled. "I promise not to leave the bed." Zoticus muttered an oath, half under his breath. He hung the damp towel over a chair, revealing the full glory of his naked body. No, she was not too proud to beg. Not when they both wanted this. "On the road, when I fainted, I thought I was dying. My last thought, my only regret, was that I hadn't had my way with you, that night we were alone in the forest camp." He stared at her for a long moment. "I'm a fool. I should have told you that night that no one had commissioned me to kill your son. I didn't know the boy existed until you mentioned him, and I would never accept a contract for a child." She should have been surprised, but she wasn't. When she'd first heard he was an assassin, she'd put two and two together and arrived at a conclusion that simply wasn't possible. She would never have suspected such a thing of the man she knew now. The man who'd saved them all, including her. And that was only a part of why she wanted him so much. She shrugged her shoulders and let the sheets fall away. She hadn't put a shift on after her bath, so now he could see everything too. We all have our moments of madness. Right now I want to savor being alive and celebrate how you saved me, and I want to do it all naked in bed with you. She'd never imagined he could improve upon his courtly bow, but seeing him doing it naked was a memory she'd treasure. The way all those muscles bunched up just so. As my lady commands. 33. For a moment, she'd looked as nervous as a new bride. Then her expression had turned hungry as she talked of madness in that purring tone, and Zoticus was lost. He found himself kneeling between her thighs on the bed, a breath away from burying himself deep inside her. Yes, she whispered. No. Once he was inside her, he wouldn't last more than a moment, and he might never have this chance again. He leaned forward and captured her lips. This kiss was slow and deliberate, nothing like that first one he'd stolen with barely a thought, before a vision had mercifully stopped him from going any further. But now the only vision he saw was her half-lidded eyes, begging him for more even as she returned his kiss. Her breasts were soft as silk in his hands, until her hardening nipples made their presence known. Only then did he release her lips, leaving a light trail of kisses down her neck and collarbone. I want to feel you inside me, Zoticus, she said. He wanted that too, but not yet. He ran his hand down her belly through her downy curls and then slid his finger inside her. He hooked it. She cried out, arching her back. His fingers worked their magic, but it was her breasts that had his attention now, thrust up toward him as they were. He sucked hard on the nearest nipple, was rewarded by her moan, and took his time on one breast, then the other, until he felt her clenching around his finger. Yes, yes, she whispered. No. First, he wanted to give her the pleasure of an unforgettable kiss. He lifted her legs over his shoulders, so they spread beautifully wide. With both hands now, he parted her lower lips, seeing them glisten in the candlelight. If he'd been in any doubt that she wanted him. What are you doing? I want you inside me, not looking at my... She blushed, like a bride seeing her first cock. You'll see, Lady Sarah. I promise you'll like it. Just as I like looking at you. And then his tongue was too busy for talking, too busy tasting, for his fingers had brought her to the brink, and it only took a few strokes to tip her over. 34. Sarah had barely a moment to realize that Zoticus had slipped his tongue inside her before sensation overwhelmed her, and all she could do was scream his name. When she opened her eyes, she saw he'd risen onto his knees, lifting her legs with him. Why, she began. His hot hard head entered her then, and she no longer cared why. All she cared about was the tortuously slow thrust as he filled her. She could scarcely breathe, he felt so good. Lady Sarah, are you all right? Did I hurt you? She opened her eyes to see his concern, but it took her a few swallows before she found her voice to respond. Heavens no, but it's so long. Forgive me, did I go too deep? I shouldn't have. He started to lower her legs, and it felt like he was starting to slip out of her. No. You're not too long. I mean, it's so long since I've shared a bed, I'd forgotten it could be this good. Sarah felt her face grow hot. Please don't stop. He laughed softly, then leaned forward to kiss her, pushing into her to the very hilt. Oh yes. She must have said it aloud, for he smiled and began to move, never taking his eyes off hers. He started off slow, but as passion kindled in his eyes, lit by the blaze between their joined bodies, each thrust became harder, faster, until she felt herself clenching around him, sucking in a breath to scream his name again. Oh God, Sarah! They came at the same moment, the most exquisite pleasure marred only by its ending. He covered her face and her breasts with kisses, still breathing hard. Then he threw himself down on the bed beside her. The second time will be slower, I promise, he said. Slow and gentle, like I should have done the first time. Her thighs still ached from the first time, and everything in between was tingling. Slow and gentle might be nice too, but... Then the third time I want hard and fast again, she said. As if anyone could make love 3 times in a single night. Zoticus began to laugh. And what does my lady command me to do on the 4th time we make love? I don't know, she admitted, but earlier I had hoped you'd join me in the bath. Maybe. Ah, speaking of baths, I should probably get us cleaned up. He produced a bowl and a washcloth and proceeded to do just that. Until he started stroking the cloth between her thighs in just the right place, and she couldn't help but arch her back up. The cloth splashed back into the bowl, to be replaced by his fingers and the rasp of his hot tongue. And the 5th, my lady, he asked. And the 6th and the 7th? His tongue rejoined his fingers and she could no longer think. All she wanted was him. Have me, however you like. As many times as possible. As long as you don't stop. Don't stop, Zoticus. Oh my God. He was the very spirit of constancy, for he most certainly did not stop, though she screamed his name until she was hoarse. And she didn't want him to, not now, not ever. One night would never be enough. 35. The next morning, Sarah awoke to a light tap on her door. Are you awake, mother? Tobias asked. In panic, her eyes darted to the bed beside her, but Zoticus had already gone. Some hours ago, judging by how cold the sheets there were compared to last night. A pity. She wouldn't have minded one more round before breakfast. Would it count as the 8th time in a night if the sun had risen? She really shouldn't be thinking such things with her son standing outside the door. Come in, she called. Tobias shouldered his way through the door, carrying a tray with what she presumed was her breakfast on it. I brought you something to eat, and a tisane from Raphael that he said will help you regain your strength. It wouldn't be as potent as Zoticus's healing amulet, which he'd insisted on using on her again last night after the 3rd time they'd made love, but she wouldn't refuse anything that might help her recover. She wanted many more nights like last night. Thank you, she said. How did the milking go this morning? A little better. With more people to show how it was done instead of just me, we ended up with more milk in the buckets, less on the floor, and it was finished before breakfast for the first time. Sal's been checking what provisions they have in the cellars here, and aside from a lot of cider, there isn't much to see them through the winter. There's an orchard of chestnut trees on the slopes below the monastery and they're ready for harvest, so I set some of the boys the task of collecting nuts. Silvana said there's a smokehouse beside the mill. It's not as big as ours, but it will give them something to do. She says she can operate the mill too, if I find her a couple of hands to help. The apple trees will yield well in the autumn. He stopped. Forgive me. I want to show you everything, but of course I can't until you are well. Do you think you will be able to join us for dinner today in the Great Hall? Everyone meets there at midday, and so many people have asked about you. If they only saw that you are well or on the way to it. If she could spend half the night making love with Zoticus, she could easily sit at a high table for an hour. She might need help getting there, but she could work that part out later. Sure, she said. Wonderful. Tobias kissed her cheek. Thank you, Mother. Some of the children are so scared, they think you have the plague. Where they came up with such a silly idea, I can't imagine. Given she'd suspected the same thing, the scared children weren't as silly as Tobias thought, but she didn't say so. We'll be safe here. I shall tell everyone so at dinner, she said instead. 36. Zoticus stayed away as long as he could, but eventually his feet found their way back to Sarah's chamber. Perhaps he should have asked her permission to heal her again, but she'd looked so peaceful last night, sleeping in his arms, and he couldn't bear the thought that his selfish night with her might delay her recovery, so he'd fed more blood to the amulet than was really wise. He'd been light-headed when he made his way back up to his own cold bed, but it was for the best. Lady Sarah was the virtuous widow everyone looked up to, and he would not take her reputation from her. She would have the strength to lead what remained of her people when it was time to return to her town, and he would be gone. But instead of doing the sensible thing and creeping out the gate last night, he'd weakened himself so much from the blood loss that he'd decided to delay for another day. The sight of her now was enough to make him both regret and rejoice in his decision. She wore a fawn wool gown today, which looked golden in the sunlight streaming through the open window. Someone, heaven forbid she'd done it herself, had opened the shutters for her, and she sat in a chair before the window, where she might admire the view over the valley. Then she saw him, and the smile that lit her face sent a bolt right through his heart. "Zoticus. I feared you were too busy to come see me today, and I need your help. I promised my son I would attend the midday meal in the Great Hall, but I suspect I will need your help getting there. Crossing the room and donning some clothes was not too taxing, but finding my way around an unfamiliar castle, I fear I might get lost and not have the strength to return to where someone might find me." His heart sank. So his healing last night had not been enough to ward off any ill effects from their lovemaking. He'd have to heal her again today, before he departed. "I'll take you down to the Great Hall and bring you back when you are ready," he said. He expected her to rise and walk with him, but she just sat in her seat, looking up at him expectantly. She wanted him to take her in his arms again, even after he'd exhausted her last night. He swallowed. Then, selfish wretch that he was, he scooped her up and carried her out of the room. She felt even softer clad in warm wool than she had last night. It took every bit of his willpower not to turn around and take her back to bed, where he would join her and... No. If she didn't appear at dinner, someone would come looking, find them together, and that would not end well for her. So he forced himself to march right down to the Great Hall, ascend the dais, and set her in the place of honor at the center of the table. Tobias's usual place, until today. Her fingers wrapped around his arm, tugging him down to her level. He expected her to say something for only his ears, but first she kissed his cheek before she said, "Thank you," loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. He glanced around. Some of the children had entered the hall, finding their seats. Then someone caught sight of Sarah, sitting at the high table, and the excited chatter began. Zoticus wanted to sit at her side, as close as possible, ready to help her in an instant, should she need him, but he forced himself to move down the table to the furthest seat to her left, where he might watch her without being so conspicuous. The younger council, as he called them, to distinguish them from their predecessors in Miroton, entered the hall. Tobias and Silvana sat on Sarah's right and left hands, and the others took their places along the bench until there was no space left, except for the careful distance the brewer's boy kept between himself and Zoticus. When everyone was seated, Tobias rose to his feet. "I want to thank everyone for all their work over the last week, preparing the castle for the coming winter and helping with the harvest. We may be here until the spring or longer, depending on how long before the plague is gone, and we may go home, but when we depart, we must make sure that the monastery is better supplied than when we arrived. And to guide us in our preparations, joining us today is my mother, Mistress Sarah." Applause and cheers rang out across the hall. Zoticus frowned. Sarah was still recovering. She could not be expected to shoulder the burden of setting an entire castle in order in such a short time. Raphael raised his cup. "A toast to Mistress Sarah's health," he shouted. The whole hall followed suit, then drank deeply. Sarah smiled graciously through it all, but when they sat down she scanned the crowd, searching for someone. Once, twice, 3 times her gaze circled the room before she saw something that turned her face deathly pale. Zoticus was on his feet, striding to her side before he could think. "Lady Sarah is easily tired and must return to her chamber to rest," he shouted. She did not resist as he lifted her from the chair and spirited her out of the room. It wasn't until he laid her in her bed that he dared to breathe again. "What's wrong?" he demanded. Her voice came out half strangled. "It's Tola and her daughter Swanhild. I didn't see them in the hall." Did they not make it to the monastery? Tears spilled from her eyes. Zoticus racked his brain, but he could not remember seeing them at all. Swanhild wasn't among the children in the church. I don't think either of them joined our pilgrimage. Sarah started to sob. He hesitated only a moment before he pulled her into his arms to let her cry into his chest. Tola and Swanhild are witches. They have powers normal people do not. If anyone can survive a plague, it's a witch. They are likely in hiding somewhere too, waiting for it to be safe to go home. If you wish, I will go and search for them, and wherever they are hiding, I will find them and send them home to you, he said. It was the least he could do for her when he left, send her friend back to her. She sat up, sniffling. What would I do without you, Zoticus? She'd do everything she did before she met him, he suspected, and her life would go back to normal. It was for the best. 37. Zoticus soon left, saying something about getting her some food. Sarah expected him to return, but Sal brought up her tray instead, asking after her health and telling her how much more complicated it was running a castle kitchen compared to helping her mother in the inn back home. Several hours later, Sal returned, swapping the empty dinner tray for Sarah's supper, but Zoticus was still absent. Do you know where Zoticus is? Sarah asked her. Sal shrugged. Master Zoticus is most mysterious, but in the mornings he comes down a flight of stairs near the kitchen. I suspect his bedchamber is at the top of those stairs. Sarah thanked the girl, trying not to show her disappointment. She knew those stairs led to her own bedchamber, not Zoticus's. But it couldn't hurt to take a look. She closed the door so no one would see before pulling the tapestry aside. A spiral stair wound its way past the exposed archway, heading both up and down. Down to the kitchens, up to where? She craned her neck and thought she might see some light at the top, but she wasn't sure. Was she well enough to ascend the stairs, to see what lay at the top? She could always stop and rest on the way, if she needed to. One turn, then another, and part-way around a third before she emerged into a round room, barely big enough for the pallet that took up most of the floor. Zoticus's sack of belongings sat beside it, and his cloak hung from a peg on the wall. The shuttered windows were all closed, but the light she'd seen came from a candle left burning beside his bed. It looked like his room at the inn, or the cellar at the mill where he'd been held prisoner. Like he'd just left a moment ago, and he didn't intend to come back. He talked of going to search for Tola and Swanhild. Surely he hadn't. Sarah fell to her knees on the pallet. Please no, she whimpered. What are you doing here? His footsteps were so silent, she hadn't known he was on the stairs until he spoke. Something told her she should stand up, but Sarah stubbornly stayed on her knees. I came looking for you. You're leaving, aren't you? He inclined his head. Of course. My work here is done. You and the children of your town are safe, the plague ships are burned, and the Bishop of Rialto wants a word with me. I thought I'd head down to Rialto and tell him the only word I have for him is no, and maybe find your friend. Then who knows? There are plenty of wicked knights in the world who are still breathing. I'd like to see how many I can stop. Did last night mean nothing to you? You said you loved me. Was that a lie? She challenged him. His shoulders slumped, and her heart sank along with them. She'd been a fool to believe him. Last night was wondrous, and I shall remember it all my days. Whether I love you or not, it does not matter, for an infamous assassin and a virtuous widow have no future together. Did you lie to me? She had to know. Lady Sarah, I have never lied to you. I love you as I have never loved any other woman, and I will treasure the one night fate allowed us to share together. Which is why I must leave you here where you will be safe, while I go and do all the things an assassin does. Things of which you do not approve. If you leave, I would go with you. You cannot. They need you here. She snorted. They do not. Tobias has already taken leadership of the young people of Miroton, and there are others who have already formed his council. You saw that as well as I did today. They will not be children much longer, and when they realize that, they will not need me. He froze, his eyes fixed on the wall or on something far away. A vision, Sarah realized. What did you see? She demanded. He dropped to his knees on the pallet too. The same as I always see. If I leave, you will run across the Bailey in your black traveling cloak. Whether I will it or no, you will follow me. He closed his eyes. Sarah, I must keep you safe. You must stay here. She grasped his hands in hers. Only if you stay here with me. He met her gaze. I'm a selfish man, Sarah. If I stay, it is only a matter of time before I am tempted to share your bed again. What will the children, what will your son say when he finds out? Does it matter? I've spent my whole life caring for their town. You saved them. Don't you think we're owed a little happiness? And if we find it together, who has the right to judge us? Zoticus still didn't smile. Well, the Bishop of Rialto for one. If he is not happy with me, he might come after you. The Bishop of Rialto relies on my generosity to keep this monastery going. If he comes after me, he will soon find it very injurious to his purse. Not to mention, if he'd sent word earlier about Altino, he might have saved the people of our town. He will not like me laying those deaths at his door. He's always coveted my family's lands. Perhaps he delayed, so that Tobias and I would die along with the rest of Miroton, and he might have my lands for himself. Well, he shall not have them. All he will have is the sharp edge of my tongue. He stared at her in wonder. Is there anything you do not have an answer for? Anything you actually fear? Losing those I love. Could you love an assassin? She cocked her head. Only if you come back downstairs to my bed. This pallet is a bit small for the two of us. If I share your bed again, I will never want to leave. She smiled. Then we have a deal. Zoticus shook his head. You drive a hard bargain, Lady Sarah. Sarah laughed and reached under his tunic. No, I believe the hardness is all yours. 38. Just when Sarah seemed to finally have recovered, she fell ill again. Instead of coughing, infection or the plague, however, this illness made her unable to eat without being terribly sick. She refused to drink anything but water, and no matter how much he used the healing amulet, it only seemed to make her worse. The sounds of me retching must have driven Tobias away from my door, Sarah said one morning when they emerged from her chamber to go down to breakfast. Worry still ate at him, but that managed to make him laugh. Oh, it's not you who drove him away, but a girl his own age who has caught his eye. He's been sleeping with the others, hoping to get closer to her since the night we first made love, or he'd likely have broken down the door at the sound of your screaming. Sarah blushed. She had the saltiest tongue when they were alone in their bedchamber, but she still blushed like a maiden. You surprised me, that's all. I did not expect you to be such an accomplished lover. Zoticus snorted. The first time maybe. But by the 7th time and every night after the first, you were definitely not surprised. The smell of cooking wafted up the stairs. Sarah froze, then bolted back to her chamber. Zoticus found her noisily throwing up in the chamber pot. He dug out a rag for her to wipe her mouth and handed it to her when she was finished. Sarah stared at the rag for a moment. How long since I've had my monthly courses? Zoticus shrugged. You haven't had them since we arrived. I didn't realize you still had those. When women reach a certain age, they usually stop, leaving more nights for lovemaking. He wasn't going to complain. For 3 months he'd shared Sarah's bed, and he knew he never wanted to leave it. She swatted him lightly. Yes, but I'm not that old. I still get them, or I did. You said once that the amulet let you sense the blood coursing through my veins when I had that infection. Could you use it to see if there is something else growing inside me? She climbed up on the bed, tugging the skirt of her gown up over her waist, baring her belly and everything beneath. Zoticus's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to take his own clothes off and… The amulet, she reminded him. Right. In a moment, then. He pulled out the amulet, and she guided his hand down to her belly. For someone who ate so little, it made no sense for it to be rounded. Not as soft as he remembered, either. A chill went down his spine. There were other incurable diseases, worse than the plague, that he also could not heal. No, not Sarah. He could hear his heart racing, the opposite of her slow, steady beat. No, a heart rate that fast would have him breathing hard and feeling like it was bursting out of his chest. He placed his spare hand at his throat, feeling for the rapid flutter he knew he should find there. But his pulse kept pace with Sarah's. I'm pregnant, aren't I? Sarah asked. Pregnant? How? Now he knew what to look for. He moved the amulet lower, and there she was. Heart beating like a frightened bird, tiny arms and legs reaching out for a hug she could not yet have, and all of her seemed to twinkle like she was made up of a million tiny stars sitting just beneath her skin. Absolutely magical. She's beautiful, Zoticus breathed. His daughter. His and Sarah's daughter. Which meant all those magic sparkles. She's an enchantress. So much magic in her blood, she cancels out anything I can do with the amulet. Memory twinged, the shared magical memories from so many generations. While you carry her, your blood mingles with hers. You should wear the amulet. It will heal you both more than I ever could. He hung it around her neck, then helped her smooth down her skirts. Let's go down to breakfast. If you're eating for 2, you cannot miss a meal. Sarah shook her head, a look of wonder on her face. I never thought I'd have another child. Not after Tobias. And a girl too, she'll be born in the spring. If Tola were here, she'd be my midwife or even Swanhild, but without them, I think I'm the only one here who has handled a birth before. And I'll be in too much pain to do everything myself. Where will we find a midwife? The first snowfall had closed the road the week before, not even the monks would be getting through until spring. I will do it. I've helped on a few deliveries before. My mother was the village healer and she did most of them, but women would go into labor at the same time, and I knew enough to handle the easy ones. Zoticus heard himself say the words, but they did not console him. This was Sarah, not some peasant woman popping out her 20th child from hips so wide she took up 2 places on a bench. I'll find you a midwife, even if I have to dig through snow from here to Rialto. You and our daughter will be fine, I promise. The words felt right, though worry still niggled at him. Sarah's lips touched his, and all other thoughts flew away. Thank you, she said. You keep delivering miracles. Saving us, saving me, and now, you've given me the sweetest gift of all. A daughter I'd never dared hope for. If there were a priest in the castle, I'd make him marry us right now for everything I have, everything I am, I would give you, and it would not be enough to repay you for such a gift. His heart soared. Yes, if he could marry any woman, he'd want Sarah, but she'd never be safe. All it would take was one unscrupulous would-be client who threatened her life, and Zoticus would be forced to assassinate someone he did not want to kill. Worse, they might hurt Sarah. He would not let that happen. But now was not the time or place, and there was no priest present, so he forced a smile upon his face as he said lightly, Wait until the mite is born before you thank me. I'm told babies do nothing but cry and steal your sleep, not to mention the ordeal of her birth. You'll be cursing me come spring, I'm certain of it. Sarah's smile only grew wider. Come spring, she'll steal your heart as surely as you hold mine. You'll see. He would, but he hoped he'd find a midwife well before then. He might have healed Sarah once, but he knew he'd be tempting fate to take her health in his hands again. 39. As Zoticus dug his way through the snow covering the road for what felt like the 100th time that year, he cursed. He hated snow, he hated ice, and more than anything else, he hated the sulfur-colored clouds heading their way that would likely dump another load of the stuff, undoing all his good work. Wasn't it supposed to be spring already? If the snow didn't thaw soon, he knew he'd be delivering Sarah's baby. He tried to confine her to her chamber or even just the castle, but she was having none of it. 3 times a day, she waddled out to the duck pond, determined to have eggs if the ducks had laid any. He lived in constant dread that she'd slip on the ice or the stairs, or trip over one of the baby goats that no one seemed able to control. He'd even gone through his magic pouch, trying to find something that would keep her safe, or at least help her keep her balance. All he'd found was a cloak pin enchanted to keep the rain off whoever wore it, and Sarah wasn't silly enough to go out in the rain. She was, however, perfectly happy to waddle out for the second time today, wearing his warmest grey cloak, for it was the only one wide enough to fasten over her enormous round belly. Her words, not his, but no matter how much he agreed with her, he wasn't brave enough to say so where she might hear. She disappeared around the corner of the woodshed, and Zoticus went back to work, shoveling snow. A flash of light in the corner of his eye made him turn. If there'd been anything but clear skies there, he'd have thought he'd seen lightning, but he couldn't have. The storm clouds were still on the other side of the valley. A shriek reached his ears that sounded like Sarah. He dropped his shovel and ran toward the woodshed. Another flash of light, on the far side of the woodshed, followed by silence. He rounded the corner to find no one there. Sarah's footprints just ended, as though a giant eagle had swooped in and carried her off. Oh God, she hadn't fallen into the duck pond. No, it was still frozen over and yards away. Sarah, he shouted. Sarah. Zoticus staggered through the snow, searching for some sign of where she'd gone. He found Raphael near the kitchen gardens, shoveling snow away from the plants. Have you seen Sarah? He asked. Raphael leaned on his shovel, thoughtful. I don't think I've seen her today, but she did ask for some willow bark to be sent up, and water to make tea. But that was hours ago. I imagine if she has a headache though, she'd have stayed in her chamber. Have you checked there? Zoticus wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry in frustration. The only times Sarah stayed in her chamber were when she was asleep or making love with him. She wouldn't be there now. Not when he'd just seen her in the courtyard. One of the younger girls, Zoticus guessed she might be 6 or 7, raced through the kitchen door, skidded across the ice patch outside, then broke into a run on the snow without breaking stride. Master Zoticus, she shouted. I'm here, child. What is it? Is it Lady Sarah? He hoped so, but she'd come from inside the castle. It couldn't be. Mistress Dahlia demands your presence in the best bedchamber right now. Mother. No, it couldn't be. Who did you say wants me? He asked carefully. The panic in the girl's voice grew. Mistress Dahlia, the midwife, says you must attend her right now. He wasn't a praying man, but if there was one midwife he'd wanted here, it would be her. What she couldn't cure with her normal skills, she might with magic. Thank you, he said, breaking into a run. He jumped the ice patch, skidding a little on the step, before taking the stairs 2 at a time to the upper levels. He could scarcely breathe by the time he reached the door to Sarah's chamber, but... Heavens, it hurts. That was Sarah's voice, raw with pain. Well, if that boy would hurry up and get here, he might be able to do something about that. He had to smile. His mother was the only person in the world who'd call him a boy. Finally. Mother snapped when he walked in. Get over here and help your wife up. She's about to have your baby, so the least you can do is hold her in the right position so it hurts less." He considered correcting her, but the pained groan that came out of Sarah made him forget everything else. Whether she was his wife or not, he'd help her get through this however he had to. Thank the heavens his mother was here to help. He drew Sarah off the bed, careful to support her weight as she stood up, before she doubled over in pain as another contraction gripped her. This was where most husbands panicked, needing to be sent out of the room in search of something that took a long time to find, sometimes quite forcefully. Zoticus understood some of their panic. He wished he didn't have to see Sarah in so much pain, but he'd be damned before anyone sent him away. It might take all his strength to bear her weight when she wanted to collapse with each contraction, but he'd hold her for as long as it took. "After this, I don't want any more children," Sarah said, before the next contraction caught her in its toils. "Never fear, she'll be your last," Mother said, dropping to her knees at Sarah's feet. She'd laid a pile of cloths on the cold stone, ready to catch the baby. There were more draped over a bench beside the fire, warming in readiness to swaddle the child when she was born. "Now Sarah, it's time to push." The sounds that came from Sarah's throat were more animal than human as she strained and pushed until finally, when his arms felt like they'd fall off after holding her up so long, a shrill child's scream rose from the floor. With her red, scrunched-up face and bloody fluid coating her body, the girl looked more like a demon than a human, but Zoticus didn't care. He knew she'd be the most beautiful girl in his world before the day was done. "Take care of the baby, Tick, while I deal with the afterbirth," Mother ordered. He didn't hesitate. He scooped up the angry, bawling baby and wrapped her in the softest, warmest cloth on the bench. When she seemed likely to wriggle free, he added a second cloth, but it just wouldn't wrap right. It had been so long since he'd helped with a birth, and he'd never been given the baby before. There must be some trick to it, something his mother hadn't taught him, but it was buried in his magical memories somewhere, if only he could find it. "Give her to me." Sarah's voice was soft and hoarse, but he did not dare disobey her order. He turned to find Sarah sitting up in bed, her arms out in readiness. Wordlessly, he handed the child to her mother. It took scarcely a moment for Sarah to wrap the baby properly, before putting the child to her breast. Zoticus's breath caught in his throat. He'd never seen a more beautiful sight. The woman he loved holding their child. "Stop staring at her breast, Tick, and go get your wife some dinner. She's just fought the battle of her life, and she's eating for two. See that the meat is well cooked, and that there is not too much wine with it." He wanted to stay, but he knew it wasn't worth his life to disobey. Not with both women ordering him about. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he met Tobias and Silvana. "Is Sarah all right?" Silvana asked. Raphael said she'd gone into labor. Zoticus broke into a smile. "Sarah is well, and so is the baby. A girl. She's resting now, but they are both well. And in the best possible hands," he added to himself. He skipped the rest of the way to the kitchen, determined to bring Sarah the best, heartiest meal he could provide. 40. Sarah waited until Zoticus was out of earshot before she said, "You're mistaken. I'm not his wife." Dahlia waved a hand like she was shooing away a fly. "Pa, but you will be. My Tick has done some foolish things in his life, that cold bitch Gemma for one, but finding you is not one of them. He's still an assassin with all the dangers that come with that job, but he'll always come back to you. He loves you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You mean I'll lose him just like my first husband?" She didn't think her heart could bear losing him too. Dahlia chuckled. "Oh no, you'll never lose him. True to his name, my Tick will stick to you until the end of your days. He'll outlive us all, you'll see. You, me, even his twin sister Zoraida. This little one and Zoraida's daughters will be the only ones left when he's an old man, dying in his sleep." Sarah allowed herself to breathe again. I'd ask how you know, but he has the gift of future sight. I take it he inherited it from you? Dahlia nodded. Tick always kept his gifts secret. No one outside the family knew he had magic at all. If he's told you, he already considers you family. He'll make you his wife soon enough. Sarah wasn't so sure, but she didn't think it wise to argue with Zoticus's mother. Not only had she just delivered her baby, but she was a powerful enchantress who could probably turn her into a newt if she offended her. Why do you call him Tick? She asked instead. 'Twas Zoraida's doing. She complained that he always followed her and her friends around like a bothersome tick when they were small children, and somehow the name stuck. Of course, it's no sort of name for a fearsome assassin, and it did not make him popular with the girls in the town where he grew up, but my Zoticus has made his name known and feared all about the world. I think more people fear him than his sister, though she has magic and he has little of it. Funny how things turn out. She fixed Sarah with her steely eye. Now, speaking of names, what do you intend to name my granddaughter? I'd thought Rossa, after my mother, who had red hair, but I wanted to discuss it with Zoticus first. Dahlia nodded. Rossa. I like it. As will he, when he's done getting you the fanciest dinner the castle kitchens can provide. But I sent him away so that I might have a word. Sarah pressed her lips together and nodded. Her mother-in-law might say many words, but Sarah's word was law here, and once her mother-in-law left, Sarah would decide what might happen, not Dahlia. Now little Rossa here is a witch. A mighty powerful one, like her aunt and her cousin. Likely she'll be an enchantress too, able to cast portals and any other spell she turns her hand to. She'll have a fairy godmother, most likely Zoraida's girl, Zuleika. I wish I could do it, but I won't live long enough to be there when she needs me. She'll have you and Zoticus, and that's good. Sarah found herself nodding. She'd have to ask Zoticus about enchantresses, and how to stop one from lighting the house on fire or shaking apart the mountain when she threw a tantrum. Cousins, she could deal with when she met them. She shifted so that she could switch the baby to her other breast, and hissed as pain erupted from her nether regions. Dahlia blinked. By all that's holy, I forgot to heal you. Don't tell Tick. She dipped her hand in the bucket that held the afterbirth, and it came up dripping with blood. She seized the healing amulet that hung around Sarah's neck in her bloody hand, and held it tight for a long moment. Sarah felt a tingling sensation start in her chest, then spread like lightning through her body. Heat built uncomfortably in her nether regions, but it faded quickly, taking the pain with it, leaving Sarah gasping. Little Ross's blood is more powerful than Tick's, Dahlia said knowingly. It was like comparing a candle to the sun. When she was ill, he'd healed her over an entire week, and she'd still felt tired. Now, she feared if she could listen to her heart, she'd hear her blood singing in her veins. When she's old enough, give her the amulet to wear always. It will heal her like it healed Zoticus, even if she's on the cusp of death. Dahlia laid a box on the bed. I brought you some wedding gifts too. Seeing as I won't be invited to your wedding. Sarah lifted the lid. Inside sat a black wool cloak, lined with silk, and fastened with a silver pin in the shape of a flower. They're very fine. Thank you. Dahlia made an impatient sound in her throat. Yes, they're fine, such as might be worn by a lady of your station, but it's the magic in them that makes them valuable. The brooch will heal you, much like the amulet does my son or your daughter, but there is no blood price to pay. I already paid it when I laid the enchantment on it. The cloak itself will be your armor. I placed a powerful protection spell on the cloth, so that as long as you are wearing it, nothing can harm you. The spell is not confined to the cloth, but the one who wears it. So if you were to simply drape it over your shoulders, and a rock fell from the mountain onto your head, the rock would bounce off and would not touch you. You'll never need the brooch, though you may find it useful. The cloak will keep you safe from Tick's enemies and those who wish to control him through you. Dread seized Sarah's heart. What about Rossa? Or my son? Rossa will grow into her powers quickly enough. She's using them already. Look. Dahlia pointed at the window. All manner of birds sat on the sill, jostling for position, yet all staring at Rossa. Songbirds, scavenger birds, someone's hunting hawk, and an eagle that normally lived high up on the mountain. Even an owl joined the strange flock. Sarah shivered. There was magic at work here, powers she did not understand. Dahlia rose. Well, that's all I think. If I think of anything else, I'll portal back here, but Tick is surprisingly capable for a man. He'll help you more than you know, though you still might have to tell him what to do from time to time. Take care of that little girl. She waved, then drew a circle with her hand. A sparkling portal appeared, just as it had by the duck pond when Sarah had felt her first contraction. Dahlia stepped through it and disappeared. Thank you, Sarah said. Too late for Dahlia to hear her, but no less heartfelt. 41. 3 years ago, if anyone had told him he'd spend more than a day in a monastery, Zoticus would have laughed at them. Yet he'd spent 2 years living here with Sarah, and as summer faded into autumn once more, he wondered how much longer it would be before it was safe to venture down from the mountains to see who else had survived the plague. They'd had no contact with anyone outside the monastery since they'd arrived, and more than once he'd caught the others discussing whether there was anyone else left. Most of them had moved out of the monastery though, and last summer a village had sprung up where a patch of forest had once stood. Some of the older children were children no more, forming their own households with their younger siblings, and a few had even taken a partner. With no priest to celebrate weddings though, he wasn't sure how long the pairings would survive. Another summer? Or their entire lives? He suspected Tobias and the miller's girl were one of the pairs likely to last. Likely because Silvana ruled the roost in their cottage. Some, like himself and Sarah, had stayed in the castle, but they'd moved from the monks' dormitories to more private accommodation when the weather was warmer. Raphael had taken the solo atop the highest tower, and he was up there most days. Watching for what or whom, Zoticus did not know, but there was a yearning in the man's eyes that said he would not be settling into the new village anytime soon. He was up there now, hanging out the window, shouting and waving and pointing at the road. Had someone finally come to the monastery? Zoticus clambered to the top of the bailey wall, so that he might see the travelers. Sure enough, he could see a party approaching, with wagons, horses, and many men on foot. Too far away to see who though. Instinct took over. He might not have taken any commissions lately, but he'd been an assassin for too long to forget years of training, or to want to wear any color other than his customary gray. Today it allowed him to disappear into the shadows, leaning against the parapet that gave a guard the best view over the gate. He could always close the gate, for news could be shouted from outside the wall, but something told him to leave it open. What's happening? What do you see? Sarah called up. So much for being well hidden. She saw him no matter what. There's someone coming up the road. A large party, like we were when we arrived. Sarah frowned. I'll go get my cloak. Which meant she was worried, and wanted the protective enchantment his mother had laid on the cloak. He wasn't going to argue, he'd do anything to keep her safe. Slowly the travelers ambled closer. They evidently weren't in any hurry to reach the monastery's walls. Perhaps they weren't fleeing the plague, and it was safe to leave. Maybe even return to Miroton. Master Zoticus? Can you see them? I think there's someone important coming. All brightly colored on a big white horse. Raphael climbed the bailey wall, then pointed. Zoticus was loath to admit the young man's eyesight was far better than his. Do you recognize him? Raphael smiled sadly. Who would I know important enough to own a horse like that? He's surely some nobleman. Maybe a prince, or even the king. If it was the king, it was a good thing Zoticus hadn't closed the gates. Kings weren't particularly fond of being shut out of parts of their own kingdom. But a royal party would be larger, with more horses, for knights did not walk when they could ride. Whoever they were, he hoped they'd brought a priest. Tobias and Sylvana, as well as some of the other young couples, were eager to wed. Zoticus shaded his eyes. If he wasn't mistaken, the man on the white horse wore the Bishop of Rialto's colors. He could not yet see the man's face, but he wouldn't have been surprised if it was the bishop himself. Most of the men with him wore the drab tunics that marked them as monks. So some of them had survived the plague then, or these were new ones come to claim the monastery as their own. Grossa! Get back here! Grossa! The girl had taken more than a year to learn to walk, but it had only taken her a day to learn to run. Grossa came barreling out of the door to the great hall, giggling madly, with Sarah a few steps behind. "Daddy!" the girl shrieked, heading straight for Zoticus, heedless of the riders already entering the bailey. "Grossa!" Sarah screamed, sprinting down the steps. The wind whipped her cloak behind her, so it looked like wings. His vision. Zoticus dropped down to the bailey and scooped up his wayward daughter, turning his back on the new arrivals to take Grossa back to her mother. "Out of the way, peasant! His Excellency, the Bishop of Rialto, is here to take possession of his new lands. Show some respect." That was a mistake. Zoticus turned to grin at the idiot who'd spoken. The Bishop of Rialto's horse, however, distracted them all by rearing up and dumping His Excellency on his ample ass in the dust. There was magic in the air, and he had not used any. Zoticus shot a sideways glance at Sarah, wondering if her cloak had done it, but found his daughter staring fixedly at the horse, who was now back on all four hooves, bowing his head in her direction. Interesting. Zoticus stepped forward and held out his hand to help the bishop up. "What are you doing here, Ambrose?" The bishop reached out to take his hand, then paled and shrank back. "Master Zoticus? I'd heard that you died with the rest of Miroton." Sarah's soft gasp at this bald statement of bad news hardened his heart against the bishop. And what was this about the bishop's new lands? These lands belonged to Sarah's family. Unless the bishop and the king believed she was dead. Zoticus's grin grew wider. Maybe the people who stayed in Miroton died, but most of the town survived by coming up here to the stronghold. Including Lady Sarah and her son Tobias. The bishop turned whiter than the snow-capped mountains behind the castle. "SS survived?" "Oh yes." Zoticus held out his hand to Sarah as he executed his best courtly bow. "Lady Sarah, may I present Bishop Ambrose of Rialto?" "Ambrose, this is Lady Sarah and her daughter, Lady Rossa." He wasn't sure how well versed Sarah was in political intrigue, but she understood well enough that when he'd introduced the bishop to her, instead of the other way around, he'd been telling her she outranked the man. She merely stood and stared instead of curtsying, like the bishop evidently expected. Muttering a curse under his breath, the bishop heaved himself to his feet, then managed a clumsy bow in her direction. "Lady Sarah, it is a miracle indeed that the Lord chose to save you from the plague that killed so many." She inclined her head just the slightest bit. The queen herself would have been proud. Maybe a miracle, or maybe it is merely good planning. Master Zoticus brought word of the terrible tragedy that befell Altino, and helped by his good advice, we came here, where we've been safe. Sadly, not all the town chose to leave, and I am saddened to hear that those poor misguided souls have paid a terrible price for not listening to wise Master Zoticus. Zoticus wanted to applaud, but he forced his hands to stay by his sides. The bishop's face turned red. "My dear Lady Sarah, you cannot possibly be serious. Zoticus is neither wise or good. The man is an assassin, and you are lucky he has not murdered you all in your beds. I insist on taking him back to Rialto with me, where he will face justice for his crimes. If you have placed your trust in such a vile criminal, it is only by a miracle indeed that you have survived." Zoticus opened his mouth to demand that the bishop answer such an insult with his sword. He'd never murdered anyone in their beds. His hand clenched on the hilt of his own blade, ready to draw it. Sarah's hand squeezed his, keeping the sword firmly in its sheath. She laughed. "Oh, you are most entertaining, Bishop Ambrose. To think someone has made up such malicious stories about dear kind Master Zoticus. Why, every person here owes Zoticus their life, some of us twice over. Had he committed any crime here, I would have seen to it that justice was served, for I am of course the landowner here. But justice is a sword with two edges, one for punishment, and one for reward. Thus, for his services to me and my people, I have resolved to give him my hand in marriage. It would be most fitting if you would celebrate the marriage rites for us, here in the castle my family built, that has sheltered us in our time of need. This very afternoon. I insist." Yesterday, Zoticus might have protested about the danger he'd placed Sarah in by marrying her. Today, he felt the peculiar urge to kneel before her and pledge his sword to her protection. Lady Sarah had finally come into her own, and he'd be honored to be her husband. The bishop looked from Sarah to Zoticus, as if he wasn't sure who frightened him most. "Yes, Lady Sarah. Of course. I would be honored. Ah, but about the castle. You see, I brought some monks, thinking this place was still a monastery. After the wedding, my dear bishop. It is not fitting to speak to a bride about business. In fact, it might be more fitting that you ask my husband." The bishop was likely to die of apoplexy before he left the monastery, Zoticus suspected, judging by how red the man's face grew. He couldn't find it in his heart to feel sorry for the man, either. He could have sent word of Altino's demise all along the river, so that all the towns would have known to turn travelers away. Instead, he'd let them all die, only telling Miroton when it was too late to save them. If Zoticus had not arrived, Sarah and all the others might have died, not all in keeping with the vile bishop's plan. "Oh, you must wait until at least after the honeymoon," Zoticus said, entering the game. "Such an honor and such a noble bride, I will scarcely know what to do with myself, let alone my lady's lands. Perhaps we shall keep this castle for ourselves." The bishop appeared to have difficulty drawing breath. Zoticus recognized the signs of impending death. He had only to continue in the same vein, and it would be assured. By the time the bishop's attendants realized what was happening and Sarah called for a healer, it was too late. A good man might have felt guilt, but Zoticus had been an assassin for a long time, and he had no sympathy for men who played games with other people's lives. "Is there a priest present? I think the poor bishop needs someone to administer his last rites," Zoticus said. "And conduct the wedding if the poor bishop cannot," Sarah said. A priest was produced, a young man who stammered his way through the Latin with all the quivering dread of a man who believed he'd be next if he didn't obey, and the bishop's soul was sent to his maker. Or the devil. Zoticus left such matters up to those who understood them. Before the sun had set, his own soul had been wedded to Sarah's, and several other couples had come forward to take their vows. So a wedding feast was laid out in the great hall, to be shared between monks and the survivors of Miroton. As Zoticus surveyed the hall from the high table, in the seat of honor with his wife by his side, he wished he'd been able to save more. But in the battle between one man and a plague, he felt it was fair to call this a victory. This has been Piper Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.